Well, a lot of the concern about North Korea is its nuclear program and exactly how much of a threat that is. Now, we know that North Korea has now announced that it's restarting Yongbyon, that is a nuclear facility that it had closed down in 2007 when talks were proceeding between North Korea and regional powers and the United States as well. Well, now, of course, with the increased tensions, there is real concern about what North Korea may do next and exactly how great its nuclear arsenal could be. Now, earlier I spoke to Ramesh Thakur. He is a nuclear expert from the Australian National University and also a former United Nations Assistant Secretary General. I asked him in general about his assessment of the North Korea threat.
Well, the reality is that no one can be confident of knowing just what is happening. Are they making these bellicose threats because they are genuinely frightened that under the guise of war exercises that the Americans and the South Koreans are conducting with some 40,000 troops between them, that under that guise they may launch an invasion or an attack on North Korea? Or is it that an effort to bolster regime cohesion? Is it an effort to strengthen domestic credibility? Is it signs of a power struggle and an appeal to the military? Because after all, the new leader hasn't been in power for all that long, just a bit over 1 year. So really we don't know as to whether they are genuinely frightened or whether they have decided to be provocative. I think we can be confident at this stage still that they don't really want a war, that they want to raise tensions short of a war, maybe position themselves for negotiations in the belief that ultimately talks will have to begin under one pretense or another.
Well, Professor Thakur, that is the optimistic view that you can get North Korea back to talks. But in the meantime, there is the ongoing threat. In your assessment, what is North Korea's nuclear weapons capability right now?
Well, funnily enough, my centre published a major report just a month ago. And in there, we come to the conclusion that as of the end of last year, so 31st December 2012, we believe with some degree of confidence that North Korea has between 4 to 10 nuclear weapons. We know they've conducted 3 tests in 2006, 2009, and again this year. The first 2 tests were based on plutonium bombs. This year, we haven't really yet been able to figure out which type, whether it was from enriched uranium or plutonium. What they have done now is they're saying they're going to restart a plutonium-based reactor that was mothballed some years ago now. That will give them the capacity from the spent fuel rods that have plutonium list around them, a capacity to make another 1 bomb per year. So we make good estimates based on how much fuel is used for enrichment, how much plutonium is used in these 8,000 fuel rods they have, and things like that. But no one can be, as I said, very confident. The advantage to them of the plutonium, by the way, is that with the plutonium-based bombs, they can miniaturize much more easily, make them smaller, and that helps them to launch them, to mount them on the missiles, which capability they tested through the rocket launch at the end of in December as well.
Well, Professor, we have seen the 6-party talks, of course, and that hasn't led to any real lasting outcome. What is it going to take to get North Korea back to the negotiating table?
Well, I think there are 3 sets of difficulties, if I may. One is that there is a long history of the North Koreans saying and promising and signing on to agreements to do various things, and then they just renege on that. If they had fulfilled their previous commitments, they wouldn't have this capacity to restart these various nuclear weaponization programs that they keep doing all the time. So there is an element of people just being fed up and not wanting to reward them for their bad behavior again and again for the same thing. So that's one thing. The second thing is the consequences and repercussions on South Korea and on Japan if North Korea is seen to be rewarded for its rogue behavior. And we already know, for example, in South Korea, some lawmakers, some MPs have started to call for a return of either American nuclear weapons or worse, South Korea to develop its own nuclear weapons capacity. And that same pressure could conceivably grow in Japan if North Korea is seen to be rewarded. But the third difficulty is, so what do we do? The reality is, they went out of the NPT 10 years ago. We believe they have 4 to 10 bombs. There is no assurance, no credible scenario that anyone can paint in which the North Koreans will agree to give up their weapons capacity. So do we recognize them as a nuclear armed state outside the NPT? Or do we still insist, no, we're going to put them back into the box, into the NPT box, and denuclearize them? That's the difficulty. I think the trick, the challenge henceforth will be, how do we engage them in talks and negotiations in a way that moderates their behavior and regulates and controls their nuclear capacity, rather than, I think, the unrealistic expectation that we can successfully, at least in the foreseeable future, denuclearize, get them to get rid of all their nuclear weapons and capacity. That's the challenge and the trick.
Wouldn't North Korea look at the likes of India, of Pakistan, of Israel, for instance, and say, well, they've been able to operate outside the system, why can't we?
I suspect that is true, but I also think that a bigger example for them will be 2003 and Iraq, in the sense that you give up your capacity, look what happens. You better make sure you keep that, because they might just come in, get rid of you as a regime, and kill you as an individual leader. So I think the long-term consequences for proliferation, ironically, were pretty bad of what happened in 2003.
Professor, is Iran in the same boat? Do they also look at Iraq and what took place there and say that if we can get nuclear weapons, then we get a seat at the table?
Iran is a different proposition, again, for a number of reasons. One, their primary thing is uranium enrichment rather than plutonium. While it's not as useful in some ways, it is more useful in that it's more difficult for outsiders to detect. It's easier to cheat, in other words, going the uranium enrichment route. That's one. Second, all our evidence to date suggests that Iran hasn't actually made the decision to get the bomb. What they have decided to do is they will keep the capability to get it no matter what. And that has a window of opportunity for discussions and negotiations. And again, just saying we are not going to talk to them doesn't help. The third factor that is completely different, of course, is the strategic environment in the Middle East and for Iran is totally different from what North Korea faces. And the fourth factor that is completely different is the China factor. China's, I think, is the key to what's going to happen with North Korea. On the one hand, this behavior by North Korea complicates China's environment for a number of reasons. They don't want an outright war. They don't want a war by mistake. They don't want North Korea selling this technology and components and missile elements to other countries. They don't want provocations that leads to South Korea and Japan thinking of getting nuclear weapons themselves. And they don't want to end up with increased American military presence right on the border. Having said all that, a worse outcome for China, I think, is to see a collapse of the North Korean regime. So a nuclear-armed North Korea that poses more of a problem for the United States and the West and their allies than for China is preferable to the communist regime as a buffer state between China and the others collapsing. We have to remember, it's the prospect of American troops right on their border back in the 1950s that provoked a Chinese counter-intervention in the original Korean War. So China is the key in terms of doing something with North Korea, but again we need to understand the boundaries within which China will put pressure and beyond which it will not go. So it all becomes a very delicate and a very difficult situation to read.
Well, in your former role, of course, as UN Assistant Secretary General, you've been very much across trying to bring about an international consensus. Now, you talk about China and China's role here, but is there a failure of the international community to really be able to break through?
I think we are moving into a different era in international organizations, including the UN system. There is unquestionably a major rebalancing in world affairs as power and wealth and influence and self-confidence shift away from the West, the United States and Europe, to some of the rest, led by China in particular, but also the Indias and the Brazils and the BRICS. And I think if we believe that for the other countries to be responsible means that they must do what we believe is the right thing to do, and they must come on to our way of thinking and therefore accept our prescribed courses of action, then I think we are in for even more turbulence and volatility and difficulties. Conversely, if we say, well, what is their worldview? What is the strategic frame from within which they approach these issues? Should we sit down and talk to them and try and work out an acceptable compromise which meets our common goals? There's a lot of evidence to suggest that China, on balance, has been more cooperative rather than disruptive in the UN system. They've been fast learners. They don't have the historical experience that the European major powers have of operating as a major power in a system that contains other great powers. Their tradition is of the Middle Kingdom. But they've been very good learners, and I think it would be a mistake to conclude that they are always difficult, always obstructionist. The key, again, is to sit down and talk to them and see how far they are prepared to go. Because they've gone pretty far in terms of toughening sanctions on North Korea, giving public statements telling the North Koreans, don't do this, rebuking them when they do, and so on and so forth. So I think if we say our way or nothing at all, we are likely to get nothing at all. Again, let's sit down and see what are common interests. Can we use the existing systems, the center of which is the UN system, to advance common goals and agenda and improve security? And in that context, sooner or later, and I think sooner rather than later, we are going to have to address the question of, well, can we really tell others not to get the bomb if we insist on keeping ours, some 18,000 of them?
Professor Thakur, a real pleasure to have you on the program. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.